Hello, my name is Henry Blyth, and I'm going to present today about my project, Behavioral Economic Solutions to the Opioid Crisis. I worked on this project under the mentorship of Dr. Karen Blumenschein at the University of Kentucky College of Pharmacy. To give a brief overview of my project, I'll first be going into the background and the history of the opioid crisis, the questions that I sought to answer with this project, and the methods that I used to complete it. I'll then be getting into my data and results, the conclusions that I could draw from it, and the further research that I hope to do related to it. To finish up, I'll go over my acknowledgements, my sources, and share my contact information for any questions that any viewers of this video may have. Background of the opioid crisis. It really began in the 1990s when there was a big push in the healthcare industry to eliminate pain. Because of this, doctors started to prescribe more painkillers, and pharmaceutical companies began to produce more and more effective painkillers as well, many of which were opioid based. Because of this increase in prescription, opioid misuse and overdoses increased nationwide. Much of the misuse of the opioids are a result from leftovers or an excess from a legally prescribed prescription that people simply don't dispose of. To combat this growing opioid crisis, states created programs that would clamp down and significantly restrict the prescription of opioids. Um, this greatly decreased the access to opioids. However, it also led to a scarcity, which increased the relative value of the opioids. So now, when people receive an opioid prescription and they have some left over, instead of simply going and disposing of them like they should, they are more likely to keep it in case they need it later because it has a higher value to them. So the questions with this project, first of all, I want to assess the excess prescription opioid value using willingness to accept. Willingness to accept is an economic valuation method that I'll get into on my next slide. But my first question is, how much money does the average person think excess opioids are worth? Secondly, I want to identify effective behavioral economic incentives. This just means I want to find ways for people to be willing to give up excess opioids that aren't necessarily money. So terms and definitions, willingness to accept, which I mentioned before, is a valuation method. It's the minimum value needed to give something up. The way that this works is in a survey. Typically, the person giving the survey will ask the participant, how much money do I have to give you for you to give this to me for some good that the participant possesses in the study? MTurk, or Amazon Mechanical Turk, is a survey distribution website. It's basically just an interface that connects requesters, people like me who create a survey, with workers, participants who will complete it in exchange for a small reward. So my methodology for this, I created a WTA survey, which incorporated behavioral economic incentives as well. I'll get more into the structure of the survey later, but it took about 10 months from the initial creation of the survey to its first distribution. It went through numerous focus groups and pilot testing to clarify it, make sure it was good as it could be. And then around December, I distributed it nationally using MTurk. I did so in 2 waves, one in December, one in January, and I'll get a little bit more into why I did 2 waves later on. My last step was just to remove the incomplete responses or just any other responses that I couldn't use for whatever reason, and analyzed that data. So survey outline, 4 main components. The first one is participant background with opioids. Here I ask, have they filled a prescription for opioids before? Did they have an excess? What did they do with the excess? Did they keep it? Did they dispose of it? Did they give it away to someone else? If so, who did they give it to? Why did they keep it? How did they dispose of it? And I get quite specific here about that. The second section was the behavioral incentives. Some of the incentives were meant to evoke emotion. or some sense of altruism. The first two, notably, were uh, informing the participant further about the opioid crisis and giving them some sort of official recognition from the government. With these, I was helping to make the participant feel like they were doing something good for society by giving them up. I had some others, notably the pharmacy drop box and the postage paid envelope. Um, the drop box is something that already exists and is growing as a way to combat the opioid crisis. And the postage paid envelope going through the United States Postal Service is a hypothetical way to make it easier for people to dispose of excess opioids. And those questions were meant simply as a way to test existing and hypothetical methods and see how effective they are compared to money, which was the third section. The willingness to accept section, this was the reason for the 2 waves of my survey. I had 10 monetary values in each wave, and each participant only saw one. In the first wave, it ranged from $15 to $775 in rather large increments that could go from $10 up to about $300 increments. After I figured out what 2 increments from the first wave that the two values from the first wave that the willingness to accept would fall between, I was able to then reevaluate the values that I used for the second wave and more accurately estimate the real willingness to accept. The fourth section was demographics, where I covered age, state of residence, type of residence, urban, rural, suburb, employment status, pay frequency, just different demographic values, demographics that I could break down further. So onto my data. These are the first few questions that I asked in the background section. About 80% of participants had filled an opioid prescription before, and 80% of that initial 80% then also kept it. So that is about a 64% of the total participants who had a leftover opioid prescription. So that kind of shows that it is an issue that people get these, they don't dispose of them. 62% of participants kept their, or 62% who had left over kept their opioids. 5% gave them away and 34% disposed of them. I wasn't asking for any illegal information on this section about drug dealing or anything. Multiple participants said that they exchanged it for different drugs. So that's kind of what falls into the other category. This is more on the background section, specifically the people who kept opioids. The vast majority of them did so for later personal use, but good portions did so for family, for friends, or they just didn't know what else to do with these opioids. They didn't know of the proper way of disposing them. This covered reasons or methods of opioid disposal. It really varied, but the most prominent were flushing down the toilet and taking to a take-back bin, which was a pharmacy drop box, like I talked about before as a behavioral solution. Not a ton of people overall, only about 20% of the total participants disposed of opioids at all, which really is not a very high number, which goes back to the idea people need to be disposing of them, and it is the excess that really causes the opioid crisis to be what it is. So this is my data for the behavioral incentives. For each incentive, participants could answer definitely yes, probably no, or definitely no. And I deemed that an incentive was good if over 50% of participants said definitely yes. So this is just the percentage of participants who said definitely yes for each of my incentives compared to 50%. And as you can see, the only two that wound up surpassing that benchmark were discount on the next prescription and the next copay being covered. These were the most monetary of the behavioral solutions, where I wanted to see would it be effective to just give people almost like a coupon for something, or money off of something instead of directly giving them cash that they could use on anything. Those are slightly different behaviorally and incentive wise. And so it wound up being that money was really shown to be the only motivating factor here. I was really hoping that things like family game would be a good incentive, but that was the uh, second worst performing incentive. Unfortunately, people don't really want to act as role models for their family, or at least don't think of that when considering disposing of opioids. These are the definitely yes percentages like before, but for the monetary values in the first wave. As you can see, I had a large range ranging from $5 to $775, and I found that over 50% of participants said definitely yes at $15 and everywhere beyond. There's a slight dip, but later on around 115 and 225, but that really is the difference of one or two people saying definitely yes. I only had 200 responses for my first wave, so only about 20 people saw each monetary value for this section of the survey. So those differences really are not um, more than one or two people saying probably yes instead of definitely yes. So because of this, I was able to see the willingness to accept is somewhere between $5 and $15, which led me to the second wave where I adjusted the values. I had $0, $5, $10, $15, clustering it closer and breaking it up more in that range. And this was able to further show me that the willingness to accept is between 5 and 10, not just between 5 and 15, which there is no formula for willingness to accept or this sort of economic valuation. It's very guess and check. So to get it within a $5 margin is actually quite good. And one of the other things that I was very thought was very good about my survey for this was that it showed that 33% of participants answered definitely yes for $0 for this survey. That question was nearly identical to my opioid crisis context question, which wound up being 30.62%. So the fact that they were so similar and essentially the same question displays good internal validity of the survey. So conclusions that I draw from this: the best behavioral solutions were the most monetary and the least emotional of the solutions. And emotion is really nowhere near as effective as money as a motivator or an incentive to get people to do things, which made me a little sad, but oh well. First wave of the WTA section showed that it was between 5 and 15. So with the second wave, I was able to narrow it down to between 5 and 10, which leads me to believe that the most effective course to get people to dispose of opioids would be to simply give them a $10 Visa card, as I specified in the full question of my survey. Further research, I want to look at combining emotion with money to see if emotion really does anything as a motivator in this sort of a situation, because the data did not really support that in my survey. I also want to break up the data further by demographics, specifically breaking down the willingness to accept by state. State by state, there are vastly different regulations on the prescribing of opioids. For example, Kentucky has a very robust set of restrictions. but neighboring state Missouri barely has any restrictions. So it would be very interesting to see how people who live in those states value their excess opioids differently. It would make sense that if they're easier to come by in Missouri, then you would value them less than you would in Kentucky, where it's hard to get them. But that would be a really interesting thing to break down. Um, the one issue with doing this for the survey that I have right now is that it was mainly people from larger states, California, Texas, New York, that responded, and they comprised about 20-25% of all responses. There were some states that only had 1, 2, 3, 4 responses from them. So not necessarily enough people to really make that call right now, but if I was able to have access to a lot more money and use maybe a better statistical company, then I would be able to look at this a little bit more. And acknowledgements, I first off, of course, want to thank my mentor, Dr. Karen Blumenshine, very much for all the support that she's shown me throughout this whole process. Her input and her help on the survey was invaluable. I also want to thank Dr. Glenn Bloomquist, not my official mentor, but I've been working with him for the better part of a year now on the survey as well, and just such a huge help. Really appreciate it. I'd like to thank MSTC, the Kentucky Young Researchers Program, for providing me this opportunity to do great research in high school, showing me how much I love to do research. Thank my parents, of course, because they're always there for me with everything and asking me questions about my survey, and just I appreciate how interested they are in me and my life and the support that they show me. And then I don't know who they are, but all 500 and some participants of my survey definitely made this possible for me. My sources, and then any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me. My email address is listed here. I could even send a PDF of my full survey if you would like to see that. That was a bit too much to go completely in depth on in this presentation, but any questions at all, don't hesitate to contact me. Thank you.